Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to discuss FXR versus Sportster. So let's just jump right into it. First things first, I want to lay out a couple of specification parameters. I'm specifically in this video going to talk about my Sportster, which is the 05 Sportster Roadster, versus an FXR S-SP. So the performance Sportster and the more performance-oriented FXR. Now the thing is that in the Sportster lineup, they had the XR 1200s, they had the Sportster S back in the earlier 2000s or late 90s, whenever it was. So there are sportier Sportsters, and there's actually not. I'm doing it. Thank you, people. There's actually sportier Sportsters for sure. Don't think there's a sportier FXR. The FXR T, which had the bags and the fairing, and the FXR S SP, I believe both had, are essentially tied for the sportiest FXRs, and the SP being slightly more, arguably, because it's slightly lighter and no fairing. Regardless, though, that's our parameter set here. The 90s FXRs, the CVO ones, I believe they were all more like lowered bikes and weren't set up for handling. And they weren't jacked up for better lean angles and whatnot. But I could be wrong on that. So anyway, that's the first things first. Second thing is, if you look it up online, this is interesting. An FXR has a longer wheelbase than the Sportster of my generation, and even the older Sportsters, which that's not too surprising, but it's actually longer than the Dynas, and longer than like the new lowrider S and ST, for example, which I guess just caught me off guard a little bit. I thought the what are we doing here? I'm getting waved down. Okay, I thought the FXR2 would be, or FXRs in general would be shorter than the Dyna, even if only by an inch or two, and maybe tied with like my Sportster. So that was interesting, and I think it's a fair amount too. I forget the exact number, but it's like 3-4 inches. Like, it's quite a bit, which on a motorcycle that's relatively short. It's kind of a lot. But what that does is, well, let's get into that later. Okay, so length, a little longer, the FXR actually than this bike. Weight, this is billed at 550 dry, an FXR SSP 570. So people think of the FXR as a more comparable bike to a Dyna. I don't know, man. Arguably, it's more comparable to a rubber mount Sportster, because at least weight wise and lean angle wise, the FXR, it's kind of hard to find this data online. I did do a bunch of looking. The FXR seems to be billed at roughly 33 to 37 degrees, and their left and right were different because the exhaust setup. So right was less and left was a little more. So I'm gonna call it we'll just call it 35 for argument's sake. So pretty good lean angles for a cruiser. My Sportster, I believe when I looked it up, is 31 or 33. I think it's 33. Billed at. I actually think that's the same left and right. I think that's what I found. Regardless, pretty, for all intents and purposes, it was 2 degrees, right? Pretty similar. Most sportier Dynas are low 30s, high 20s. The new lowrider S is billed at 31 or 32 or something like that. So basically, the FXR, out of the box anyway, probably has a couple more degrees of lean angle than this Sportster, or the new lowrider S. Soft tail lowrider S, to be clear. Not the Dyna lowrider S. The Dyna lowrider S only has 30. Anyway, so let's back up a little bit. Sportster Roadster FXR, right? The specs I just gave you, fairly close. Now, they both have 39mm front ends in the correct years. Oh, by the way, I'm talking the Evo FXR SSP, not the shovelhead one. Only because of, you'll see in a minute. Power-wise, the big twin Evo motors put about, I don't know, some people correct me on this if I'm wrong, but 60 something wheel probably around there. They were not powerhouses in stock form. The 1200 Sportster Roadsters had a little bit better heads and cam from the factory, so you know they're putting more like high 60s, 70s to the wheel. Actually, a little more powerful despite being smaller, and the bike's a touch lighter. So I mean, stock for stock, and torque is still good and everything. I mean, stock for stock, this 1200 Sporty will outrun a Evo Big Twin any day of the week. I don't care what bike it's in. So that's something to consider. But yes, we've established all that. But this is the big one, right? The reason people absolutely covet the FXR, like put it on a godlike pedestal, idolize it, that's the word, is for its handling characteristics. The resounding claim is FXR is the best handling Harley ever made. You'll hear that everywhere. So the reason for that, of course, being triangulated frame, Derek wheel design, good steering angle. I believe the steering angle is like 30 degrees. The rake of the forks, 28 to 30, somewhere in that range. This bike is too as well. They've got pretty tall rear shocks, so you get the better lean angles and comfier ride and all that kind of stuff. So the Sportster of my generation, the rubber mount ones anyway, they have whatever frame they have, right? It was designed by whoever, and it's definitely a much different frame design than the FXR. So the interesting thing about this Sportster frame is the front tubes are thicker than an FXR, but they're not triangulated. So an FXR frame tees up to the neck. Sportster frame is actually straight. So it's a definitely different geometry. Those straight bars go wrap underneath the motor, which that's not too much different than like an FXR. The frame's a little thinner probably than an FXR frame, just from looking at them. I haven't measured them, although I could. The reinforcement around the steering neck on the Sportster is a little less, like slightly lighter, so that might make a difference. Maybe not. Maybe not. The rear swing arm setup is definitely different on the Sportster. The FXR has this weird like pass-through giant bowl that goes through like a 3-bolt flange thing. I don't know how to describe it. That's butchered it, but definitely a different design than any other Harley that I've seen, or really any other cruiser in general. But this guy is more of a traditional like Harley Dyna style swing arm, for lack of a better term. I think the Sportster has an extra motor mount compared to the FXR. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, the point is there's definitely some difference in frame, like frame, not only size and dimensions, but the type of construction. So that brings me to my next thing, handling. So the Sportster on paper has all the characteristics, though, other than the frame geometry, of the FXR. I mean, it just does. It's a pretty similar sized bike, similar weight, a little more power actually. It's got all the pedigree, if you will. So how does that translate to real life? Well, here's the thing. I have unfortunately never ridden an FXR. Sadly, I freaking want to. I need to find somebody who has one who will let me ride it. I don't know anybody as of yet. So we'll work on that. But until then, I do have some interesting data points for it. So I've ridden this bike for a bazillion years, 10, 11 years now. I've done various suspension mods to it, and it handles pretty darn good. I'm not 100% satisfied, but I'm getting into the 80s, 90s, getting into the 90s probably. I'm getting to the point where like it's little stuff that I'm trying to fix, not major stuff. Keep in mind too, an FXR, most people will agree needs aftermarket suspension to really unleash its full potential. The SPs did have like air shocks and some different things that you modify damping, but they were not as good as an aftermarket setup. So I'm kind of comparing comparing these bikes aftermarket to aftermarket, not so much stock to stock. Because the bone stock Roadster sucked. This suspension was garbage stock. So unfortunately, these bikes are way underperforming from factory. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. So, never ridden an FXR, obviously ridden this bike a lot. However, I rode the new Softail Lowrider ST. That video's up. And that bike handled absolutely phenomenally, okay? And on real world, had similar lean angles to this, you know, not noticeably less. On paper, it's a little less, but it really wasn't noticeable. Multiple people that I've watched on YouTube who either I can confirm have, or at least claim to have ridden FXRs, say that it is now, quote, the new best handling motorcycle Harley-Davidson's ever made. So, that's interesting to me, alright? So, you know, I always say you never want to meet your heroes. I've always wanted to ride an FXR, but after hearing that and knowing how that bike felt, and how that bike felt similar to this bike, the Softail Lowrider S, you know, handling wise, I don't know. Maybe the FXR is not quite as good as my mind had you know, stacked it up to it. Yeah, so I don't know. I got to. I'll have to still ride one, of course, but it's just interesting because maybe this thing handles like better than I think it does, and maybe the Lowrider S handles worse than I think it does. If that makes sense. And the FXR is still king, but I don't know. So for what it's worth, Harley's been making some big changes. They got 20 plus years of new tech. As smart as Eric Buell was, it was a long time ago, and that was a computer controlled. Computer designed motorcycle, the FXR. So computers are a hell of a lot stronger now. So I don't know. I mean, they might have done different force analysis and you know, gotten some chassis flex out of it. The big disadvantage of the Lowrider S compared to this Sportster or the FXR is it's just heavier. You know, they're like 100 pounds heavier. Yeah, 70, 80 pounds heavier. Just the 6-speed trans, the twin cam motor is a little heavier. So, you know, that's whatever. I mean, it feels great, so it kind of doesn't matter. But if weight's a concern to you, then there's that. So yeah, from a pure handling perspective, I don't know. I think, well, I could say between my bike with mods and that Lowrider S bone stock, handling-wise, they're like a dead heat. Honestly, the Lowrider S probably takes it by a little bit, but this thing does still handle pretty good. The old Dyno Lowrider S, with all due respect to anybody who has one, I thought it rode like a dump truck. I was thoroughly disappointed. I really thought it was going to be better. It didn't have as much lean angle as I thought it should have. I shouldn't say no lean angle. It just didn't have as much as it should have. And just the suspension was bouncy, and you're in the corners, you were doing this, and I don't know. Anyway, yeah. Has the FXR been dethroned? I don't know. I haven't ridden one, so I can't tell you. If I can get a hold of a, you know, gently modified FXR with the right suspension setup, I can confirm that answer. I'd like to ride a Lowrider S more, just to be sure, but I've ridden this enough. If I could get 100 miles on an FXR and 100 miles on a Lowrider S, I could give you at least in my opinion, you know, who the actual king is. Yeah, so we'll see if I can make that happen someday. But until then, we can just theorize a little bit and use the data that we do have. And one last thing I'll put into this. I rode the Street Bob, Softail Street Bob, the new one, and that just has regular 49. You coming in my lane, bro? Coming in my lane, bro? No? Okay. The new Street Bob has just has the 49mm forks, not the inverted forks, the Lowrider S. And just like regular rear shock, a little lower and stuff. I mean, it had less lean angle, but it still was like super smooth through the corners. So the Street Bob with a non-performance suspension setup actually rode phenomenal also. So you know, again, not as good as the Lowrider S, but very, very good, especially compared to outgoing Harley. So that whole new Softail platform that Harley has, I was super skeptical at first, but it is as good as they claim it to be. Shockingly, I can't believe I'm even saying that. So anyway, I think we're good on this one. I will talk to you guys later. Thanks for watching. God bless America. See you on the next one.